Thank you very much for coming on to this talk. The research is based on the work that I was doing for the Friends of Waikumete. Might be a bit closer, otherwise I'm leaning over like mad. For the forthcoming book on the Soldier's Corner, which is the story of the soldiers' burials, a special area set aside at Waikumete Cemetery. But I did a presentation like this, also when they were having the Waikumete Cemetery Open Day, and then just suggested to Shona that perhaps you might want to have this talk, and then she wound me up with this. So thank you very much indeed, Shona. In this period, though, of First World War centenaries, and yes, I know they're going on, and perhaps you may be having a bit of First World War centenary burnout, but in 2018 is the 100th anniversary of the first burial at the Soldiers' Cemetery of Waikumete. And I'm presuming that the Friends of Waikumete will be making a fuss of that, which, as quite rightly they should. Waikumete was the first municipal cemetery to set aside an area for a soldier's cemetery. There was already a cemetery at Featherston Camp right from 1916, and the cemetery at Featherston had been going since the early 1880s. But Auckland, as a municipal cemetery, they just beat Karori down in Wellington by a matter of 6 months with the first burial, for the simple reason that Waikumete was already getting set up and redeveloped and extending, and poor old Karori had to buy extra land, have arguments over buying the extra land, clear some trees, arguments over clearing the trees, sorting out land leases and land titles and everything else, then finally got their cemetery up and running. Although their cemetery has far more burials than Waikumete in terms of the Soldier's Corner, ours is older than theirs. This way? Techniques, fancy stuff. The cemetery itself is part of the watershed for the Wairau Creek, which feeds into the Wau River, with very steep, broken terrain in places, which is probably the reason why in the government in the 1860s, when they set aside the parish of Waikumete and subdivided farms for sale, this particular area they didn't put up for sale. It remained as wasteland. It was offered in 1876 to the Auckland Provincial Council as a replacement cemetery for Simon Street. The Auckland Provincial Council, of course, 1876 was in the process of winding up and being replaced by our current system, which is central government and the local councils. So everything was then passed over really to Auckland City Council. It took them a wee while to get going and organise themselves for taking over the cemetery, because they actually wanted a cemetery. Some of them wanted a cemetery in other places, including Aoraki, which would have been very interesting if that had actually worked out, and the one councillor actually won the day. That would have been a whole different bastion point protest. But no, they chose Waikumete, the cold clay out in the west. The rail line had already been put through the bottom of the Waikumete Cemetery along the Glen Eden line with the shopping centre. A special shunting line had been set aside so that they could offload the coffins, and people can then go and follow their loved ones to the final rest. So Waikumete started. But the council, when using Waikumete, of course, well aware of that rough, rugged terrain, they're only using one third of the whole reserve that had been set aside. And in that 1/3, they initially had the, I want to see if this works, that's all their denominations: Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, Public, Nonconformist, etc. All in that single 1/3 of the whole area. As a very rare photograph from the 19th century, from the 1890s, of Waikumete, extremely rare. Waikumete Cemetery, the Friends of Waikumete, and people who are enthusiastic about the cemetery's history, we are still hunting for any more images similar to this, which is historically interesting, and it's valuable in seeing how the cemetery looked before a lot of deterioration happened and overgrowth and everything else like that. But that's actually a really, really interesting view, and it gives you an idea of what the cemetery was in the 19th century. Of course, I'm not here to give you a general talk about the cemetery. I'm here to give you a talk about the Soldier's Corner. Right from the first year, 1886, there were military burials. There were wood burials amongst, of course, in the general cemetery as per denomination. Now, this is not Auckland. This is, I don't know where this is. It's from the National Library. They didn't give a location, but it does give you a good general idea. The coffin on the gun carriage and the procession, and there was music. There was usually set music that was played. Procession taking the coffin to the Mount Eden station for loading onto the train, or sometimes they did a procession all the way along Great North Road and along into Waikumete itself. But that gives you a general idea. In 1886, I say there was the military funerals were just like the general ones, but George Hazell, the first one in August 1886, he lies in an unmarked grave. His wife did not give him a headstone. She went off back to home to England soon after he died, and so he lies in a plot that is unmarked. And of course, the veterans associations that did spring up, there were early veteran associations. They took on veterans of the New Zealand Wars and other imperial wars and everything else, and then when their members died, they tried their best to give their members a proper funeral. One of the early associations, though, had considerable difficulties. In the first funeral that they started, they got the band at Waikumete, they got the rifles at Waikumete for firing over the grave, they had all the officers and everything else, they had the minister, everything sorted out. And then they realised they'd left the body back in Auckland Hospital. True story. So they tried again the next time one of their members died. We're going to do this better this time, that's fine. They got the body. I probably opened the coffin, make sure they got the body this time. Right, okay, that's fine. They got the rifles, they got the music, they got the people dressed up and everything else. And then they forgot that they booked to book the minister. They did hold the service. The head of the association did a layperson's service over the grave and everything else, so they did do it that properly in that respect. But at that point, I think that's part of the reason why they just decided to give up, and that particular association drifted off into history. They weren't all like that, bless their hearts, but I thought to myself, well, these sort of stories. Right. Come the Boer War, and that's the Second Anglo-Boer War from 1899 through to 1902. So there were concerns made in London as to how the soldiers who were dying during the Boer War in all the actions all across South Africa their remains were actually being cared for. They started forming sort of impromptu cemeteries like this. This is a photograph of one from Getty Images. But they thought, well, who's going to look after these graves? Who's going to look after these cemeteries? And say our poor boys there. And of course the British don't go carting bodies back. They don't do repatriations like the Americans have done since halfway through of last century. So they started organising associations with the view of looking after these graves. And one of the associations that they started up was a Soldiers' Graves Guild. Now, the Soldiers' Graves Guild had many branches. The main branches, of course, as I said, were in England, but there were branches here in New Zealand. And they basically paid for the headstone if the family could not afford one. They paid for the burial if the family couldn't afford to do that, just to make sure that the soldiers had a proper burial. And here in Waikumete was the first of the Boer War soldiers who died and whose headstone was provided by the New Zealand Soldiers' Graves Guild as marked on the stone. Poor old Frank Gomes, Portuguese by origin. He was born here, his family all came from Portugal. And the sad thing was he went to war in South Africa at the beginning of 1902, which would have been a good time because 1902 things were coming to a halt. It's kind of like going to the First World War in about October 1918. You stood a very good chance of surviving. But in his case, on the troop ship coming back, he contracted measles. One of the other regiments had measles rife in their training camp, and they just loaded straight onto the boat with the measles, and everybody got the measles. He came down with pneumonia as a complication of that, and died soon after actually reaching New Zealand and coming home, which is rather sad. Actually, measles was one of the deadliest diseases to kill soldiers. Pretty well just as much deadly as the two influenza epidemics that went through, the 1916 that people don't know much about, and the more famous 1918. These days we just consider it's just a disease and we have vaccines against it, unless of course you don't vaccinate yourself. And me myself, I had measles when I was a youngster anyway, so, you know, but in those days it led to complications, it led to pneumonia, it killed people. And it was a sad thing with Frank Gomez. Come World War I, the same concerns about Boer War graves and the graves of men who died in battle and died at the battlefields, and how to look after the remains and how to set up cemeteries overseas continue with World War I. These are graves of officers, not just ordinary men, officers at Gallipoli, which I found was surprising. And it's the nicest photograph I could give you here. I could give you a really horrible photograph of piles of bones laid out and everything else, which is of the men, but I won't do that. That actually, if you want to see a photograph of that, have a look for the book. There's a book on the Imperial War Graves Commission, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as it's known now, and how that's set up. It has all these photographs of the images which concerned people at the time. In this country, only charitable groups were attending to the needs of families who could not afford to bury their loved ones, or veterans who had no families at all. And one of them was the King's Empire Veterans that set up soon after the coronation of King Edward VII. These groups, along with the RSA, the Return Servicemen's Association, the Return Soldiers Association, and the Soldiers Clubs, actually petitioned Auckland Council to set up a Soldiers' Corner. Now, as I said before, ordinarily that would have been a huge ask. But as it happened, right from 1915, 2 years before the pleas to actually open up the Soldiers' Corner were made to Council, Council was already going through the process of extending the cemetery. They realised that in that third of a third, which they had been making do with for the entirety of the 19th century part of their existence, they were running out of room. Just like today, when there is talk that Waikumete Cemetery will have to close ultimately because it's run out of room. But in those days they still had the room, and they realised there was a nice neat little corner at the corner of Glenview and Great North Road. Now, in this area here. It was actually up on the top of the slope, naturally draining down into one of the gullies. And they thought, well, that might be a good place for a Soldier's Corner. They got one of the locals from Gleneden to contract. He cleared all the gorse, did burning. He actually had part of his contract. If he found any kauri gum, he could keep that. By that stage, of course, there was no kauri gum left.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Yeah, while I can collect my thoughts, go for your life.
I thought that if you were killed in the course of, being in the armed services, that the government would pay for your funeral. Is that not the case?
Before World War I, no.
Oh, okay.
Before World War I, no. This is the whole point. The setting up of things like the Imperial War Graves Commission, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and everything else. New Zealand government have an agreement with those commissions to look after those cemeteries and everything else that are in France, Belgium, Italy. One of my relatives is actually in a cemetery in Italy from World War I. But that's it. And they're not repatriated. I mean, that special doobie they had for repatriating the unknown soldier, that was a special case. They just don't do that. In this country, I am skipping ahead here, but this country, in terms of even the headstones, it's a 50-50 deal. The government will pay 50% for the cost of the headstone, and the family paid the other 50%. So it's never been really 100% or anything else like that. But in terms of this, what the RSAs were asking for, and other groups were asking for, was the council to waive burial fees for soldiers who were buried in the Soldiers' Corner. And the council said yes, this would be fine, because initially they thought, well, If we do that, that'd be great, because what we understand is the RSA will be taking over the Soldiers' Corner. They will be administering it. They'll be looking after it. They'll be mowing the lawns. They'll be taking care of things. Therefore, we're not having to have that cost of looking after that cemetery. Well, that didn't actually quite work out that way. Because, yes, it was fine in the heat of patriotism and looking after your fellow man and everything else to suggest this. But as the RSA has quite rightly said, with what money? With what money? And so the council realised after things have been set up, oh cripes, it's a bit different from what we actually considered. But they did lay out the plans, and they laid out the original layout there, and you can still see that layout pretty well with the lanes and the drives and the avenues that are set aside at the cemetery. And they were laid out in denomination order, which I found surprising. I thought myself it would all be like one Soldiers' Corner, but it was denominational still. Catholic, Presbyterian, non-conformist. So the final plan for the Soldiers' Corner was approved in August of 1917, and as I said, they had the intention of the RSA to run the cemetery. The RSA says no. So there was always a sense of it at arm's length between the council and for the administration of the Soldiers' Corner. I've been reading the files, and I've got photographs of the files from the Auckland Council archives at home. It's a begrudging, oh, okay, we'll have to do this, and if the undertakers would write to say, can we put this around in this grave, can we have this style of headstone, can we have this, and the council, oh yes, whatever you like, basically just go do it, you know, we want to get on with other things, just go do it, and that would be fine. But then they ended up being caught also between the RSA and the community and the demands from government, who actually wanted uniformity. The government, of course, part of the Imperial War Graves Commission brought in, everybody should have a single style of headstone and an established font and decoration for that headstone, and it should be made of this material, etc., etc. The government thought, okay. They actually had competitions and asked for quotes for styles of headstones, and one person who was quoting for a headstone set up a sample headstone inside a government office in Wellington that promptly fell down and, you know, almost injured somebody when it did fall down onto the floor. That's a story all in itself. I won't go into that because this just goes on and on and on with everything else right from the end of World War I into the 1920s, the late 1920s. And the Victoria League were the only really good ones. The Victoria League came up and they said, well, we really fondly believe in this. We think it's a really good idea, and I'll tell you what, we'll actually help look after the graves. And they even employed returned servicemen to go out there, even with little clippers and even scissors in some cases, to gently and minutely get all the weeds cut down around the graves and the surrounds and everything else to make things look neat and tidy. So well done, the Victoria League. They said, well, we'll just go ahead and do it. We'll just go ahead and get this done. Mind you, I noticed that there's war memorials up and down the country now starting to call themselves cenotaphs, so I think we're going to be a country full of cenotaphs at this rate. It was always meant to be in the original plan. The city engineer actually marked it as part of his plan, little square, saying that's where the war memorial was going to be. But when it came down to 1920, and the council said to the city engineer, draw us up the plan. The city engineers drew up the plan, everything else, presented it to the council, and then the solicitors said, well, by the way, you can't put a war memorial up on the cemetery. You can't pay for it. Some part of the regulations or law said to the council, you can't do that, it's not part of that. It's some Cemetery Act or some such. Well, the mayor at the time, that was Mayor C.J. Parr, he thought, okay, right. So he trots down the road, he was a member of the local RSA, and he trots in there, he says, well, here chaps, we've got this issue, we'd like to put this war memorial up. We can't put the war memorial up. How about you? The RSA has a meeting. Oh yeah, look, we've got some funds and everything else. They probably had some slight funds for the council sort of going from a separate funding stream anyway to help them along. And by Anzac Day of 1921, they got it organised. They got Parkinson to design the war memorial. That's Parkinson's design, you see there on the left-hand side. And that's the war memorial as it was in June of last year. Of course, now they've changed the surrounds again, and they're going to reopen the new war memorial surrounds in time for Anzac Day next year. But yes, basically, it's, if we can't do it one way, we'll do it another. It's been a popular area. It was popular for crowds to come for both Anzac Day and for Remembrance Day on the 11th of November. Masses of people. That building there was the original morgue, the original mortuary, which was pulled down. And further, other buildings further back, just a sea of people, and you can see them all there around the war memorial itself. The Soldiers' Corner looked like any other part of the cemetery to begin with. Concrete surrounds, various styles of headstones as the families wanted, and that's fair enough. And that gives you an example of an image of how it used to be. Today, it is lawn cemetery, and it's been lawn cemetery primarily with just strips of concrete and the headstones all in line since about just after World War II. There was moves to actually make it a lawn cemetery before then, but that's really when it did start. They went through, they contacted as many relatives as they could, and they did a demolition of most of the surrounds and most of the headstones, reset some headstones on new mounts, but basically got rid of the concrete surrounds. And so it's just this easy to maintain, easy to care for lawn. Unfortunately, they also have covered over the central path in between the graves, which makes it a bit easier to actually like go up and in between the lines of the graves and everything else, and not worry, as I worry, about stepping on somebody else's grave, because I'm sorry, I have a problem with doing that out of respect. But aside from that, that's how it is today. Before, while families were waiting for the government issue headstones to come through, their loved ones had a wooden cross. Now, sometimes those wooden crosses were there for quite some time, quite some years, particularly as it was getting into depression in the 1930s, and there was longer and longer waiting lists for these headstones to be prepared. And interestingly enough, the headstone here for Mr. Mazzolini, poor Mr. Mazzolini, he was up on a roof in Remuera fixing roof tiles when he suddenly had a heart attack and fell off the roof. They figured the heart attack actually killed him, so the fall did not kill him. He just died of a heart attack and fell off, but he was a returned soldier, bless his heart. The cemetery has extended through. It's gone beyond that corner now. It's now almost down, pretty well down to where the administration offices are. It's included naval seamen ones that had passed away by accident or disease on ships that were visiting New Zealand in the 1920s, 30s and 40s. The soldiers who returned from World War II and have since died, they have their place in the Soldiers' Cemetery, whether it's burial or more normally these days cremations. And a number of burials cremations were made, and they were stored at the old mortuary chapel. When it was demolished, then they were buried in a common grave, in a common plot, by the Chapel of Faith in the Oaks. And that's that monument there to those names of those that actually died in service due to World War II or just after, and the cremains were relocated. But that memorial is actually further down the hill and away from that area. You also have the American soldiers who died here in New Zealand during World War II, buried briefly at Waikumete, repatriated by the US government soon after World War II, en masse, in one great project and everything else, and then conveyed back home. This is the grave of the first burial at Waikumete in the Soldiers' Cemetery, William Eli Johnston of Piopio. And I always feel sad about that he died of tuberculosis in Auckland Hospital in January of 1918. His cross actually did stand upright. Of course, as naturally happens with monuments like that, these fall down. At least they have placed it on his grave. And his grave is one of the few that's been left alone as is. That's the original surround. and everything else that was there when he was buried. So that has not been converted to being the lawn style of headstone or gravestone as a lot of the rest of them, the other ones have. So if you want an idea of how they all used to look like, that's how they used to look. Nurse MacLeod. Nurse Louisa Campbell MacLeod. Now she posed an interesting problem for council when she passed on. When she died in 1938, she was a serving wartime nurse. She had a rank. She had a rank as a sister. She had the right to wear military uniform. She served in the Cairo hospital and in hospitals in England before she came back at the end of the war, and also did some war service and military base service here in New Zealand. Auckland Council, though, initially said, but we thought the soldiers' cemetery was for men. I kid you not. We thought it was soldiers is men, you know, and not nurses. Actually, they actually did have a male nurse buried there who was a British birth, and he came here, and I'll be talking about him shortly afterwards. So she wouldn't have been the first nurse, but you know, she was a woman. But the RSA said, well, she still served. As far as they were concerned, she still served. And the council said, well, okay, if you're okay with it, we'll do it. So she was the first woman buried in the soldiers' corner. This really gets to me though, which is Maki Allen. Maki Allen was born in Niue Island on the 22nd of April 1893. He was not one of those part of the October contingent, the Niuean contingent, which a lot of, and actually quite right, attention was made in October of last year and on Anzac Day of this year, but there were two burials in Waikumete who were not part of that contingent, and he was one of them. He actually worked on a ship called the Isabel, which had been in another life one of the Southern Cross boats that was used by the Melanesian mission to connect him between New Zealand and the missions out in Melanesia. When it was sold in the 1890s and sold to a Captain Ross, he renamed it the Isabel with a Y. And Maki Allen took up employment in there, and he was engaged to be married. He had a fiancée back in Niue, but he did that so he could earn a living and travelled with Ross to Tonga, to other islands as well as to Niue, and of course down to Auckland, New Zealand. Come in November 1915, he came into Auckland and there was no work. There was no work for the boat. There was nothing to pick up, no cargo, and so he was let off, probably temporarily. Ross would have probably taken him on. But even at that stage also, another problem was Ross was looking to sell the Isabel because he thought, you know, the business was getting a bit slack with the war. So Maki Allen looked around and he thought to himself, oh, okay, there's a possibility of going into the army. That was a steady wage. That was a steady income, and the income could have gone back to his relatives on Niue. So he went ahead and enlisted. He actually enlisted a month after the regiment, the Niue regiment was formed and went through Narrowneck Camp. He was actually assigned to the field, the New Zealand Field Ambulance, number 3 Field Ambulance on the Western Front. So he had a completely different path from his fellow Niueans in that other regiment. He served on the Western Front for a considerable time, right from 1916 through to October 1917 when he was wounded at one of the battles near Ypres. His right leg was shattered by a gunshot. He was sent back to England and he was invalided in hospitals for quite some time while they worked extremely hard to put his right leg back together as best as they could. They got to a point where, yes, they felt his recovery was going to be good. He would not be able to do any heavy labouring work as he had done before, but he could at least still have a life and get around. Unfortunately, the shock of his right leg getting shot, and he would have been going in and out of these hospitals, of which they had a lot of psychiatric cases as well in these English hospitals. he lost his mind, bless his heart. He actually started having delusions. On top of that, he was diagnosed on the Marama coming back to New Zealand as being terminal with tuberculosis. So they gave him a bed in the mental hospital in Point Chevalier, and that's where he died. The sad thing was, when I was reading his mental health file, his mental hospital file, he was in a perpetual state of fear right up to the end. He felt that someone was coming around the corner to shoot him, almost every second of the day. But his burial at Waikumete was arranged by the military authorities, which was a good thing. His name and that of Hono Pauwhai, who is another one of the two Nuians who were not part of an October contingent. Hono Pauwhai served in Gallipoli. They are on the main road Nuian War Memorial at Mount Roskill, but they are at the bottom, underneath all the other names of the October contingent. And as sort of like afterthoughts, oh, well, then there's these other names. I'd actually like to see them on some sort of a decent memorial at Waikumete. And actually, along with a lot of other Pacific Islanders who actually did serve and also lie in Waikumete. But that's just me. That's just my personal thing. Okay, after that slight downer, this guy was a bit more lively. William Thomas Adair Longhurst. Love his name. When I photographed his headstone, and it was broken like that, and it's still broken like that, that made me want to research him and find out more about what he was about. What I found surprised me in the dead of night, as family historians and genealogists do research in the dead of night. I think there'd be some nods that you end up getting on the trail and you just can't stop, and that's it. He joined up in 1914, and he served in the Samoan Advance of 1914 as a second lieutenant. He went in immediately at that commission, at that rank, because he said, I am already second lieutenant from the Wellington Volunteer Rifles. And so the military authorities, in a hurry, in a rush, to get this contingent pulled together to go to Samoa, as basically a Samoa relief, after they'd taken it from the Germans. Thought, look, that's okay, that looks okay, that looks sus. That's the thing with World War I. There was no record checking. We're so used to records being cross-checked and counter-checked with our internet society, our digital society. You didn't have that in those days. If you said this, you were believed, unless they knew definitely otherwise. So in his case, yes, he went there as a second lieutenant. He developed gastritis, though, and he returned in September 1914, so he was only there a matter of a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, before he returned back to New Zealand. That wasn't his fault, that was all right. And he self-discharged. He requested staff duties back in New Zealand in December of 1914, once he felt a bit better. And by then, the authorities decided to look into his credentials a bit more. And they said, hang on, second lieutenant at the Wellington Volunteer Rifles. They contacted them. No, we haven't got a record of him being second lieutenant. Who made him a second lieutenant? Apparently it was another acting officer who made him a temporary second lieutenant until something else could be filled in, but it was always a temporary thing. And then he turned around and he says, no. I earned a commission. I was granted a commission and a rank by the Tongan government when I went and I reorganised their Royal Guard. And they didn't believe him that either. The Tongans said they didn't know anything about him. And I'm sitting here thinking, if you reorganised the Royal Guard, mate, you'd have been doing it as a teenager. I somehow don't think the Tongans would be making a teenager a second lieutenant. But anyway, I don't think he was a pathological liar. He just believed this. He believed this completely. But anyway, he turned around and he says, okay, right, I still want to enlist. I'll enlist as a private and I'll work my way back up. And actually he did. He took exam after exam after exam and worked his way back up to being second lieutenant. So you've got to give him credit for that. You really got to give him credit for that. At one point he was injured during bayonet practice at Trentham. And so he was appointed as simply as a testing officer, as a desk job, while he got over the bayonet, I think. He was pronounced fit for overseas duty, and then he got sick again. So he went back on the list and back to a testing. Finally, he was pronounced fit when they were drawing up a troop ship heading for Sydney. And he got as far as Sydney before, taken ill again. Didn't like the thing, so he basically saw Sydney Harbour. Bye-bye Sydney Harbour, came back to New Zealand. Continued illness meant he was off strength until from September 1917, he was absorbed into the general list. They retained his rank. In November 1917, they commissioned him as lieutenant. Then came March 1918, when Fuller's Hayward, in conjunction with the British authorities, decided to screen patriotic movies about the Battle of the Somme and the different battles in France and Belgium, and this was a last-minute, last-dash enlistment drive. And they contacted the army authorities, and they said, by the way, you have this Lieutenant Longhurst. Is it all right for him to wear his uniform while he is addressing our audiences in the halls before the film? And the authorities thought, well, that's all right, this is for patriotic purposes, that's okay, he can wear his uniform, so that's fine. So they screened the Battle of Arras, and it went up and down the country and everything else. It was all full of British guns shelling Vimy Ridge, tanks in action, all the other daring do. Look at this exciting stuff you could be part of if you sign up and you don't mind the possibility of dying. The interesting thing I found was that bit. The series will be lectured during the evening sessions by Lieutenant Longhurst, NZEF, lately returned wounded from France. I double-checked, I triple-checked. Was there another Lieutenant Longhurst floating around? Nope, it was our bloke. It was our bloke that barely got to see Sydney Harbour, who was two to 3 weeks in Samoa, lately returned wounded from France. I don't know what he gave in his talks, or whether he turned up maybe limping with his bad leg that he got done in bayonet practice at Trentham. I have no idea. But I thought myself that he had nerve. He had nerve. Anyway, he tried throughout the 1920s to actually get back in and to get back into the staff department, and the army at that point said, look, no. Well, they'd looked at his record. He kept being sick all the time. He wouldn't be much good. They'd take him on. He'd be away home sick the next day. So I thought to myself, no. But what he did, he actually got a job at HMS Philomel on the North Shore, training the cadets in basically the 3 R's. Some of the cadets were coming through, they were enlisting with the Navy, but they had poor literacy, poor mathematics skills. So that's what he was doing. He was teaching them basic school skills and everything else, reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, bit of history, basically getting them back up to par so that they could serve in the Navy. And because he was a teacher at HMS Philomel, they would always give someone a rank who was a teacher teaching the cadets. So there'd be none of this, oh, you can't talk to us because you don't have the rank. Well, he did, he had a temporary rank. So he got his full military funeral at Waikumete, courtesy of the Navy, and with his temporary rank. I like his story. I don't know why, I just like his story. Yes?
What did he die of?
What did he die of? Heart attack. Yeah, heart finally got to him. Killed over.
He should have buried in the sea.
Oh, he probably would have liked that. But yeah, I'm fascinated by him because I thought to myself, he wasn't doing anything bad to people. He wasn't taking advantage of anybody really, or taking money for things that he was just had this belief of all these sort of strange things. Upgrading the Tongan Royal Guard to serving in France and becoming back wounded.
I'm fascinated with the uniforms
Oh, for this, yes.
He died in 1926. They're very much Victorian
Yes,
headgear.
very, very much, very traditional, very formal. And then there was this, when I was photographing the headstones, as I say, in June of last year, I was struck by this. I thought to myself, what's a springbok doing on one of the headstones? And this is a chap who died in 1919. I thought, what is somebody who served in the South African infantry dying in New Zealand? So I had to look him up. And in briefly with William Johnston, he enlisted in South African infantry in 1914. He served a total of about 206 days before he was invalided due to sickness, similar to Longhurst probably. He got over it and he tried twice more to re-enlist with the South Africans. Each time they said, no, you're just not well enough. So by early 1918 he decided, well, no, to heck with this, I want to serve in the war. And so he did actually what a lot of people did around the British Empire. If one country or colony or dominion wouldn't take you on anymore, they'd go to the next one. They'd go to another one and enlist there. And that's what he did with New Zealand. He came all the way out to New Zealand, essentially just with the clothes on his back and a few measly belongings in a small bag, and came here to try to enlist. But by the time he came here, his tuberculosis, which eventually did kill him, was very bad. And so the authorities said, right, that's it, you're in the isolation in Auckland Hospital, and that's where he stayed until the end of his days. His father did get his belongings. They sent his father the belongings back. They tracked him down through the South African records and everything else. And his record was one of the few records that hadn't been digitised by Archives New Zealand. So I asked them especially to digitise it. It's now digitised online. So people can actually see his record and see his story, even though he's not a New Zealander. I just felt it was so sad. And so that's the reason why we have the single springbok there in the middle of World War I record soldiers in the soldiers' cemetery, was because, yes, he'd served in the South African Army, but he was just that keen to try to serve again, even though he was sick with TB. And then we have Mr. Brewer Harris, who is actually Norman Charles Harris. Interesting. I don't know how I feel about this gentleman. This is the gentleman who would have been probably the first nurse buried at the Soldiers' Cemetery. He served as a royal nurse in Plymouth with the Royal Army Medical Corps. His story, forgive me for slightly reading this out, but his story at the time of 1911 English census, he was working as a clerk at the Labour Exchange in Plymouth. In October of that year, he signed up as a clerk with the Royal Navy and served in various naval bases on the south coast of England until July 1914. He enlisted on the 15th of August 1914 with the Royal Army Medical Corps as a male nurse. He was assigned to the 4th Southern General Hospital in Plymouth. From late August to mid-October 1914, he was hospitalised at the hospital with appendicitis. He then married in April 1915 and had at least one child before coming down with influenza from February to March of 1916. That was the 1916 influenza epidemic, which I personally say is the part 1 of the part 2, which happened in 1918. Then he reported severe abdominal pains from July to February of 1917 that saw him hospitalised a third time. So he wasn't doing a hang of a lot of work at the hospital with all this sickness. He was then discharged from the British Army in March, and he later claimed that this was due in general to dysentery. Oddly, then he decided to leave his wife and child in Plymouth and come all the way down here to New Zealand in August 1917. And this is why I don't know what to really personally think of this chap. A month later, he filled out an attestation form for home service with the New Zealand Army, in which he told them, yes, I am married with one child. And his previous service was that as a male nurse at Plymouth, which is quite correct. He was, though, turned down, apparently on health grounds. And then he tried again in May of 1918, this time stating he wasn't married with a child. Again, I may be being judgmental here, but I'm thinking, excuse me. I wasn't married with a child, he said, and he was simply attached to the RAMC Imperial Forces previously. He was accepted and appears to have been sent down to Featherston Camp, but on his military file, the next document dated the 21st of June 1918 is a certificate of leave in lieu of discharge. He was granted leave without pay in lieu of discharge until further orders. So obviously he was starting to sicken. He returned to Auckland after this, and he actually died in Royal Terrace, Mount Talbot, from the second, more deadly bout of influenza in 1918. His obituaries wrongly give his service in England as being with the Royal Engineers. So he went from being a male nurse to being an engineer. Well done. But that's based on what the people around him here knew of him from what he said or what they thought he said. So it's like with any death record, any death certificate, it's only as good as the information that goes into it that is known at the time. His name was hyphenated with his mother's maiden name, was Brewer Harris. So although his British war record is Norman Charles Harris and all other records in that, his funeral records are Brewer Harris. The records with the Undertaker is Brewer Harris, which is Little and Sons, and he's down as NC Brewer Harris on his headstone, on his military burial. Despite no indication in the files of his last name being anything but Harris. And it is not known to what happened to his family in England. I still haven't been able to track that down, of course, because the records just aren't available at the moment. Although you look interested, Shona. Yes, I'd be intrigued to find out what happened to his wife and Kitty. But yes, there was just no indication of them whatsoever in all the records. And then we have Ronald Henry Mayne. I thought he was going to be a nice, easy one. I look up Ronald Henry Mayne in Archives New Zealand's military files, get a bit of a short bio, write it down, give it to Friends of Waikumete for the book. No, it didn't end up being that way at all, because I had another name as connected with that plot, and I thought to myself, why is his other name connected with the plot? And I soon found out why. He died in January of 1917 of heart failure. His military file noted it could have been exacerbated by alcoholism. That's common as for those days. Everything else, his name, his age, his origin, even who he married, all became speculative though. As Ronald Henry Mayne, he enlisted with the Auckland Infantry Battalion in January 1915, and at that point he claimed he'd been born in America, therefore was a citizen of that country, in 1880, and he worked as a dentist in Hamilton. And apparently he worked as a dentist or some other mechanical dentist in Newton. I have no idea what a mechanical dentist is, and I really don't want to find out, I don't think. Unsubstantiated, his file noted as next of kin was a Mrs. H. Yend in Melbourne, and that was a friend. No, Mrs. H. Yend was his wife. Strange man. And the truth started coming out just before he died, and it came out on his military file, because they apparently called him up and they said, by the way, Mr. Mayne, your real name is Henry William Yend. Why have you been lying to us all this time? Now, he actually signed an attestation form, but all his information that he gave was true and correct. You would have thought he would have got more than just a slap on the wrist and, well, tally-ho chap, go off and don't do it again. But that's the way it was. He completely falsified his attestation records, and absolutely. It only came out because his wife in Melbourne suddenly contacted the authorities and asked why her pension had been cut. And they said, what do you mean? And they said, well, I'm his wife. They said, how could he be his wife? You're his friend. No, I'm not. And so the truth came out. There were stories abounded, actually, in some of the reports that he actually had married another woman in England while he was convalescing. I don't know what happened with that. I don't know if she was Mrs. Mayne, Mrs. Yend, or what name she would have been under, if she existed. But he's an interesting gentleman. Alberta Louise Yend wrote to the War Pensions Department, and she explained that she was a widow with 3 children. The eldest 13 years old. The eldest boy, according to a note on the file, was born in Calcutta in 1904. The other children were born in Victoria, Australia in 1907 and 1909, shortly after which our man Henry took off over the Tasman, crossed the ditch, went to New Zealand and set up his new life in New Zealand. I have no idea why. It'd be interesting, but he's one of those. You would think with an unusual name like Yend, you could track him down in trove and in papers past. No. Strange but true, this gentleman. Anyway, he's slightly mucked up things for the Waikumete Cemetery database because they've got one plot that's under main and one plot's under Yend, but actually it's all the same plot number and everything else, and they have Yend in that, and I really am hoping that that's actually him under there and not some other man with all the won't really know. Actually, I think he's a bit of a tangle. I think they're just sort of saying, leave it as is. That's it. Leave it as is.
At the end of the story. Yes,
indeed. And we come to, I'll just do it quickly. I had to do it quickly because I've taken far too much time. I'm sorry. This man is a man of, I would say, of doubtful military record. I don't know if he didn't serve, I don't know if he did serve, but it's dubious. Patrick Henry Shine. Now, he's best known in the books and the histories and whatnot for being the man that when he died in February 1913, his body was disinterred by two Australians who were after doing an insurance scam, James Arthur Talbot and Gordon Thomas Mackay. They took the body, they stowed the body for a time in a garage in Ash Street in Avondale, therefore my area gets a bit of the fame of this story. They rented a batch at Piha, they took the body to the batch at Piha and they arranged the body on a cot, then they set fire to the batch at Piha, burnt the whole thing down, and Talbot ran out and said, my mate Mackay, he's still in there. He can't come out. He was all in pyjamas and everything else, and the Piha residents tried frantically to sort out the fire and to quell the flames, but they were unsuccessful, so that's the remains of the batch. And when they found the charred remains, oh, that must be that bloke Mackay, oh, poor soul, you know, he's only just come over from Australia and he's died. So they buried him at Waikumete in another spot with his own wooden cross and everything else. And then the Australian insurance company started asking questions. Well, excuse me, this is a bit convenient, this is a bit wrong, where's all the data and all the information? They asked the police here in Auckland to investigate. The police dug up the remains again, and they found that there was some suspicious things and some cotton wool attached to part of the remains, which actually would have been inserted into Shine's corpse at the hospital. And everything else. They thought, well, so why is cotton wool there? And other items. They eventually found Gordon Thomas Mackay alive and well in a boarding house in Parnell. So, you know, he wasn't burnt up. And then the whole thing of the scam came out. So Shine ended up being reinterred back again. So he was disinterred, he was buried, he was disinterred again, then reburied what was left, and there wasn't much of him left by that stage. Basically parts of a skull, some vertebra, some extra bones, that was all that was left after this Piha cremation, back into his grave, and the headstone you see there. But that's not all with this chap. And while I was doing this book, one thing I was doing with all of these stories was checking the military file. Now I saw on the headstone that he had, he was served in the Australian forces, and his brother actually said that too. So he's got an Australian Imperial Forces badge on the top of his headstone. And I thought to myself, well, it should be a relatively easy thing to check that regimental number in the AIF records, which are also now available online with the partnership with Archives New Zealand, National Archives in Australia have done the same thing. And I found it was a completely different name and a different battalion. Because he served with the 34th Battalion, this guy served with the 33rd Battalion. The other news was Mr. Popel never came back, he's dead. He died in the Western Front, he never returned to Australasia. So I thought, okay, that's a problem, but there could have been other issues, there could have been administrative things. I went looking further. There's another one there, a chap who had one number 3148. They struck that out because they realised, the Australians realised, hang on, there's somebody else has got 3148, we've got to give him another number. Somebody else already got 2839, we'll make it 2839A. Harry Morgan. Harry Morgan is interesting because he was similar age to Patrick Henry Shine. He came from Wanganui up in the far north. Patrick Henry Shine was born in Wanganui in the far north. Also Roman Catholic, had a similar occupation. Patrick Henry Shine is believed, I'm trying to apply it and I'll show you in a minute, as a cook. This guy was a cook and a groom. This guy was a cook. And I'm sort of wondering, okay, maybe he served under another name. Possible, but I still don't know for sure because he had a different height. He was apparently 2 inches taller than the Patrick Henry Shine I did find in the Aussie records, and he was heavy. Well, you could adjust the weight, but I don't think you could adjust the height unless he went on tiptoe suddenly. So I don't know. That's sort of as extra information. So same age, but different height, different weights, same religion, same locality in the far north, served in the same battalion. Then I went digging further and I found on their list there was an attestation form, an application for Patrick Henry Shine. I thought, really? That wasn't digitised, so I paid for the digitisation. It was worth the $20 odd. This came back and I thought, well, this is interesting. Why didn't this guy actually serve? He apparently had secondary syphilis. So as soon as they cropped up against that, no, you're not serving. I don't know if this man is our Patrick Henry Shine either. I mean, it may or may not, but it's sounding to sound very coincidental here. And the fact that Harry Morgan, on his record, he was actually treated for VD at one point, I just don't know. I really just don't know. So, but what I'm just saying is, Patrick Henry Shine, if he served under that name in the Australian Imperial Infantry Forces, there is no record of his military service. Not under that name, not under that number, not under any other thing. So I have no idea whether these two gentlemen here are the same. I mean, Harry Morgan with a cross there, that's telling me they were saying he's illiterate. And yet the H is actually the same style of H as in Patrick Henry Shine's signature. It's very strange. Very strange indeed. So who was Patrick Henry Shine? Well, he was born in the early 1880s. Exactly when, I don't know, because I've yet to find his birth record. It gets worse. There's Patrick Henry Shine, who was a cousin of his, a first cousin of his, who was born around about the same time, but different parents. I mean, it was just a cousin, so I don't know if it's this chap. In 1901, he was charged with pig stealing near Wanganui, but the charges were later dropped. In 1912, he and a cousin went down Victoria Street, threw stones through a window at a restaurant, and then he legged it while his cousin got taken up by the cops, and he never appeared at the court to take part of the blame. He let his cousin wear the whole thing. I know that makes me sound like I'm being harsh on him, but that honestly is what happened. In 1914, he married Georgina Hogger, who came from a family also connected with Wanganui. A son, William Trevor, was born to them a month earlier than that. According to later testimony from Georgina, the couple lived together for 5 months, but she also said that Shine deserted her and their son in 1916, with £100 of her money meant for starting a picture show and travel to Australia. This may, however, have happened actually in 1915 or late 1915. Patrick's brother Cecil stated in 1939 that his older brother was of a restless disposition, left his home to seek his fortune in Australia, left a wife and Kitty behind, Kitty actually a babe in arms. Said to have joined the 34th Battalion, later altered it in court testimony to the 38th Battalion, but the headstone hasn't been altered. Early in the war, and said to have taken part in the 1918 Somme offensive. Cecil B. Shine by that point was Vice President of the Auckland Returned Soldiers Association, and all information on Shine conveyed to the media during the court case to do with the stolen body and the stolen remains all came from Cecil. Now, I'm not saying he was lying. He was a JP as well as being head of the RSA. He is probably going on what his brother, Patrick, told him. So, again, we still don't know. What brought Patrick down eventually was heart attack. He had cirrhosis of the liver, so hard drinking, his heart giving out and everything else. If he was Harry Morgan actually was gassed 2 or 3 times during World War I, but I have no idea, of course, if he was Harry Morgan. Georgina sought a dissolution of marriage from him in 1924. Public notices are posted throughout Australian newspapers. Shine did not respond. In 1929, he finally returned to Auckland. He was a poultry fancier in Newland in 1931, was bankrupted until 1935, and then he was in business as a furniture dealer until he was too ill to continue work, according to his brother. So, who is this man? I still don't know. It's just, the whole point is that he's not only got this interesting story of what happened after his death, which is factual, that is history, and there's no disputing that. We have all the information. It's what happened before he died is just as interesting and just as mysterious. So those are just some stories. I could go on for another 2 hours, really, with some of the stories of some of these guys buried there at Waikumete. But yes, I really encourage you to have a look. I really encourage you to do your own exploration and watch out for the book that will be coming out from the Friends of Waikumete on the Soldiers' Cemetery. Even that will not have everything in it, but it will lead you to a start with looking into this very interesting part of the cemetery. So thank you very much for listening.